On the morning of February 21, 1991, a plain white envelope arrived at the Central Intelligence Agency's headquarters in Langley, Virginia, addressed simply to Director of Security. The envelope bore no return address and had been postmarked in Arlington 3 days earlier. Inside was a single sheet of paper typed on what appeared to be a manual typewriter, containing 4 sentences that would trigger one of the most intensive internal investigations in the agency's history. The letter read, "There is a Soviet agent operating at a senior level within your Directorate of Operations. He has been active for at least 6 years. He drives a Mercedes and recently purchased a house in Great Falls for cash. You might want to examine large cash deposits in 1985 and 1986. The envelope was opened by a junior officer in the CIA's Office of Security, who immediately recognized its potential significance and walked it upstairs to the Counterintelligence Center. By 10:30 that morning, the letter sat on the desk of Sandra Grimes, a 47-year-old counterintelligence specialist who had spent the previous 5 years trying to understand why the agency's Soviet operations had been systematically collapsing. Grimes read the letter 3 times, made a photocopy for the file, and walked down the hall to show it to her colleague, Jeanne Vertefeuille. Together, they took the letter to their supervisor. The 2 women had been investigating what they called the problem since 1986. Between 1985 and 1986, virtually every CIA asset inside the Soviet Union had been arrested or executed. Officers who had been providing valuable intelligence for years had simply vanished. Dead drops went unserviced. Scheduled meetings never occurred. Through various intelligence channels, confirmation began arriving that these men had been arrested, tried, and in many cases executed for treason against the Soviet state. Sandra Grimes had joined the CIA in 1967, straight out of college, hired as a reports officer working on Soviet affairs. She was the daughter of a State Department employee and had grown up in various overseas postings, learning to speak German and French fluently. By 1991, she had spent 24 years analyzing intelligence from Soviet sources and had developed what colleagues described as an encyclopedic knowledge of the agency's operations inside the USSR. She was methodical, precise, and had a reputation for never making assumptions without evidence. Her colleagues sometimes found her rigorous approach frustrating. She refused to speculate, refused to make leaps of logic, and insisted on documenting everything in writing. But these were precisely the qualities that made her valuable for this work. Jeanne Vertefeuille was 59 years old in 1991 and approaching retirement after 33 years with the agency. She had spent most of her career working on Soviet operations, first as a reports officer and later as a case officer specializing in Soviet recruitment operations. She had a master's degree in history from Columbia and spoke Russian fluently. Unlike Grimes, who was reserved and analytical, Vertefeuille had a reputation for being blunt and occasionally impatient with bureaucratic procedures. She chain-smoked in her office despite CIA regulations and had been known to walk into senior officers' meetings uninvited when she thought they needed information she possessed. The losses had been staggering. Dmitry Polyakov, a GRU general who had been providing intelligence to the United States since 1962, had been arrested in 1986 and executed in 1988. Sergei Motorin, a KGB officer working for the CIA, had been arrested in 1985 and executed in 1987. Valery Martinov, another KGB officer recruited by the CIA, had been arrested in 1985 and executed in 1987. Adolf Tolkachev, a Soviet military researcher who had provided invaluable technical intelligence about Soviet weapons systems, had been arrested in 1985 and executed in 1986. Vladimir Piguzov, Vladimir Potashov, Gennady Smetanin, Gennady Varenik, Leonid Polishuk, and Sergei Vorontsov had all been compromised, arrested, and executed. In total, at least 10 major CIA assets inside the Soviet Union had been lost between 1985 and 1987. The CIA's Counterintelligence Center had been trying to understand what had happened since the pattern first became clear in late 1985. The initial hypothesis was that the losses were due to surveillance, that the KGB had somehow detected the CIA's communication methods or had been following American intelligence officers in Moscow. But this theory didn't explain the scale and timing of the losses. Too many assets had been rolled up too quickly across too many different operations using different communication methods. By 1986, the hypothesis had shifted toward a penetration of CIA communications. Perhaps the KGB had somehow broken the agency's encryption systems or had compromised the CIA's Moscow station, but extensive technical reviews found no evidence of compromised encryption or communications security breaches. By 1987, the hypothesis that no one wanted to consider had become unavoidable. There was a mole inside the CIA itself. Someone with access to information about Soviet operations was providing that information to the KGB. The question was who and how to find them without alerting them to the investigation. Grimes and Vertefeuille had been assigned to review every Soviet operation that had been compromised, trying to find a pattern. What they discovered was that all of the compromised assets had one thing in common. Their identities or existence had been documented in CIA cable traffic or operational files that were accessible to officers in the Soviet East European Division of the Directorate of Operations. This meant the mole had to be someone working in or with access to SE Division files. SE Division employed approximately 200 people in 1986, including case officers, reports officers, analysts, support staff, and administrative personnel. Some had left the CIA by 1991 when the letter arrived. Others had been transferred to different positions, but a substantial number were still working in positions where they would have had the requisite access. The letter provided the first specific lead pointing toward an individual rather than a category of suspects. Someone with a Mercedes. Someone who had purchased a house in Great Falls for cash. Someone with large cash deposits in 1985 and 1986. These were concrete details that could be investigated. The investigation proceeded with extreme caution. Grimes and Vertefeuille understood that if word leaked to the mole, he would either flee or sanitize his activities in ways that would make it impossible to build a prosecutable case. They also understood that investigating fellow CIA officers was politically dangerous within the agency. The most notorious example was James Angleton's destructive mole hunt in the 1960s and 1970s, which had paralyzed CIA Soviet operations for years and had ruined the careers of several officers who were later determined to be innocent. Grimes and Vertefeuille began by pulling financial disclosure forms for all officers in SE Division who had the requisite access to the compromised operations. CIA employees were required to file annual financial disclosure statements that listed their assets, including real estate holdings and vehicles, though they didn't require detailed bank statements showing deposits and withdrawals. These forms were kept in the Office of Security. The search for officers who drove Mercedes cars and owned houses in Great Falls produced a list of approximately 30 names. Great Falls was an affluent suburb of Washington, D.C., located in Fairfax County, Virginia, about 15 miles from CIA headquarters. It was known for its large properties and expensive homes, populated by senior CIA officers, lawyers, lobbyists, and business executives. A house purchased there for cash suggested significant wealth, well beyond what a CIA officer's salary would typically support. Mercedes ownership was also relatively common among senior CIA officers. The agency paid its senior employees well, not as well as private sector executives, but well enough that a GS-15 or senior intelligence service officer making between $70,000 and $100,000. Zero per year could afford a Mercedes if they chose to prioritize that purchase. What narrowed the field was the mention of large cash deposits in 1985 and 1986. Cash deposits of significant size would have been unusual for a CIA officer whose income came from regular salary payments deposited directly into their bank account. Large cash deposits suggested income from an undeclared source. The problem was that the Office of Security didn't routinely review employees' bank records to obtain bank records for a CIA employee. The investigators would need probable cause and would likely need to involve the FBI. Since the FBI had jurisdiction over counterintelligence investigations involving American citizens, Grimes and Vertefeuille were not yet ready to involve the FBI. They wanted to develop more information internally before triggering a formal investigation that would inevitably become widely known within the intelligence community. They began systematically reviewing the background of every officer on their list. They looked at career histories, assignments, access to compromised operations, and any indicators of financial stress or unexplained wealth. They looked for patterns of behavior that might indicate someone was living beyond their means or had changed their lifestyle suddenly in 1985 or 1986. One name kept surfacing: Rick Ames. Harold James Ames, who went by his middle name Rick, was 49 years old in 1991. He had joined the CIA in 1962. Ames had spent most of his career working on Soviet operations, first as a case officer in Turkey, then in New York running operations against Soviet diplomats assigned to the United Nations, and later in Mexico City. He had been assigned to CIA headquarters in Langley in 1983 to work in the Soviet East European Division's counterintelligence group, which gave him access to operational information about virtually every Soviet operation the CIA was running. He knew the identities of nearly every significant Soviet asset, their communication methods, their meeting schedules, their dead drop locations, and the intelligence they were providing. Ames drove a Jaguar, not a Mercedes, which initially made him seem like an unlikely match for the letter's description. He lived in Arlington, not Great Falls. However, when Grimes pulled his financial disclosure forms, she found something interesting. Ames had purchased his Arlington house in 1989 for $540,000, paying cash. He had also made significant home improvements in 1989 and 1990, and he owned the Jaguar, which he had purchased in 1989 for cash. Where had a CIA officer making approximately $60,000 per year obtained the money to pay cash for a $500,000 house and a $40,000 car? Ames's financial disclosure forms listed his wife, Rosario, as a co-owner of the house and car. Rosario was Colombian, and Ames had met her while assigned to the CIA's Mexico City station in the early 1980s. They had married in 1985, and she had moved to the United States to live with him. According to Ames's financial disclosures, Rosario had family money from Colombia. This was the explanation he had provided to the Office of Security for his substantial assets, but Grimes found this explanation suspicious. She knew from her review of the compromised operations that 1985 was precisely the year when the CIA's Soviet assets had begun to be arrested. If Ames was the mole, 1985 would have been when he began receiving payments from the KGB. The timing was too coincidental. Grimes shared her findings with Vertefeuille, and together they began to build a more detailed picture of Rick Ames's life and activities between 1983 and 1991. What they discovered was a pattern that, in retrospect, seemed impossible to have missed. Ames had been an alcoholic for most of his adult life. This was not a secret within the agency. Multiple officers who had worked with him over the years reported that he drank heavily, often appeared at work hungover, and had been removed from at least one overseas assignment in part because of concerns about his drinking. His first marriage had ended in divorce in 1983, partly because of his drinking and partly because of an affair he had been having with Rosario while still married. In April 1985, Rick Ames walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and volunteered to become a spy for the KGB. This fact would not be definitively established until his arrest and confession in 1994, but the counterintelligence investigation that began in 1991 eventually reconstructed the timeline and circumstances. Ames later stated in his interrogation that he had initially intended only to make a single contact with the Soviets to obtain money to help with his divorce expenses and his planned marriage to Rosario. He said he walked into the embassy on April 16, 1985, and offered to provide the names of 3 Soviets who were working for the CIA, all 3 of whom were actually double agents already controlled by the KGB, so their exposure would not cause significant damage. In exchange, he asked for $50,000. But the KGB officer who met with Ames that day, whose identity would later be established as Viktor Cherkashin, deputy chief of the KGB's counterintelligence section at the Washington embassy, recognized immediately that Ames was in a position to provide much more valuable information. According to Ames's later account, Cherkashin asked him what access he had, and when Ames described his position, Cherkashin realized he was talking to someone who could compromise virtually everything the CIA was doing against Soviet intelligence. Over the following weeks and months, Ames provided the KGB with the identities of every significant CIA asset inside the Soviet Union. He gave them names, operational details, communication methods, and meeting schedules. He handed over CIA documents containing classified information about Soviet operations. In exchange, the KGB began paying him substantial sums of money. By his own later admission, Ames received approximately $2.7 million from the KGB and GRU between 1985 and 1994. The initial payments in 1985 and 1986 totaled more than $1 million. But in February 1991, when the letter arrived and Grimes began investigating Rick Ames, none of this was yet known with certainty. What Grimes had was a pattern of suspicious circumstances, unexplained wealth, timing that correlated with the compromises, and extensive access to all of the operations that had been blown. Grimes and Vertefeuille decided to review Ames's travel records. They pulled his travel vouchers and expense reports from the agency's administrative files. Between 1985 and 1991, Ames had made numerous trips to Latin America and Europe, supposedly to meet with CIA assets or to attend operational meetings. But when Grimes cross-referenced these trips with operational requirements, she found that several seemed to have no clear operational purpose. Ames had traveled to Bogotá, Colombia, multiple times, which he explained as visiting his wife's family. He had traveled to Caracas, Venezuela, to Rome, Italy, and to Zurich, Switzerland. Some of these trips had operational justifications in the files, but others seemed to have been approved with minimal oversight. More significantly, Grimes discovered that Ames had access to funds from a CIA operational account that he controlled as part of his counterintelligence duties. The account was intended to pay for operational expenses related to Soviet operations, including payments to assets and funding for surveillance operations. But the accounting for this fund was not rigorous, and it would have been possible for someone with Ames's access to divert funds for personal use without detection. By June 1991, 4 months after the letter had arrived, Grimes and Vertefeuille had developed enough information about Rick Ames to justify moving forward with a more intensive investigation. They briefed their supervisor, who approved the next step, involving the FBI in a formal counterintelligence investigation. The FBI assigned the case to a team of counterintelligence investigators led by Special Agent Les Weiser. Weiser was a veteran of FBI counterintelligence operations who had worked on numerous espionage cases. He understood the sensitivity of investigating a CIA officer and the need for absolute secrecy to prevent the suspect from fleeing or destroying evidence. The investigation that began in mid-1991 proceeded with painstaking slowness. The FBI obtained legal authorization to place Ames under physical and electronic surveillance. Agents began following him to work, documenting his movements, photographing him meeting with people, and recording his activities. They installed listening devices in his Jaguar. They obtained court orders to monitor his telephone calls. They began the complex process of documenting his financial transactions by serving subpoenas on banks and financial institutions where he held accounts. What the surveillance revealed over the following months was increasingly incriminating. Ames was observed making unexplained trips to various locations in the Washington area, sometimes driving circuitous routes that suggested he was checking for surveillance. He was seen placing chalk marks on mailboxes, a technique used in espionage tradecraft to signal meeting times. He made calls to numbers that could not be immediately identified, and his bank records showed the large cash deposits the letter had mentioned. Between 1985 and 1986, Ames had deposited more than $1 million in cash into his bank accounts. The deposits came in increments small enough that they didn't trigger automatic reporting requirements to the IRS, but large enough that they represented an enormous amount of undeclared income. Subsequent deposits in later years brought his total unexplained deposits to more than $2 million by 1991. The financial evidence was damning, but it wasn't yet enough to arrest Ames. The FBI and CIA needed to establish definitively that he had been in contact with Soviet intelligence and that he had provided classified information. They needed to catch him in the act of espionage or to find evidence of espionage activities that could be presented in court. The investigation continued through 1992 and into 1993. During this time, Ames continued working at the CIA, unaware that he was under intensive surveillance. He had been transferred from the Counterintelligence Group to the Counter-Narcotics Center in 1990, which reduced his access to Soviet operations but did not eliminate it entirely. He still maintained his security clearances and had access to classified information, though not at the level he had enjoyed in his previous position. In October 1993, the FBI investigation reached a critical point. Surveillance had detected that Ames had scheduled a trip to Moscow, ostensibly for counter-narcotics liaison work. The FBI and CIA were concerned that if Ames traveled to Moscow, he might be warned by his KGB handlers that he was under investigation, or he might defect. The decision was made to accelerate the investigation and prepare for his arrest. FBI investigators obtained a search warrant for Ames's house in Arlington. On October 9th, 1993, while Ames was at work at CIA headquarters, a team of FBI agents entered his house and conducted a covert search. What they found was devastating. Documents containing classified CIA information, notes describing meetings with Soviet intelligence officers, and materials related to espionage tradecraft, including chalk for signaling and items used in dead-drop operations. But the FBI did not arrest Ames immediately. The investigators wanted to build an even stronger case, and they wanted to determine whether Ames was working alone or whether there were other conspirators. They continued their surveillance and monitoring for several more months. On February 21st, 1994, exactly 3 years after the letter had arrived at CIA headquarters, FBI agents arrested Rick Ames and his wife Rosario as they left their house in Arlington. At approximately 7:42 a.m., Ames walked out the front door carrying a leather briefcase and wearing a dark suit. The temperature was 34 degrees, and frost still clung to his Jaguar's windshield. Rosario followed moments later, locking the door behind her. As Ames reached for his car door handle, 3 FBI vehicles pulled into the driveway simultaneously, blocking any exit. Special Agent Les Weiser stepped out of the lead vehicle and walked toward Ames with his FBI credentials raised. "Mr. Ames, I'm Special Agent Weiser with the FBI. You're under arrest for espionage." Ames's face, according to later reports from agents present, showed no surprise, only resignation. He was handcuffed and placed in an FBI vehicle. Rosario was arrested separately and was told she was being charged as a co-conspirator. The arrest triggered an immediate crisis within the CIA. Senior officials, who had not been informed of the investigation, were stunned to learn that a veteran officer with decades of experience had been working for the KGB for nearly 9 years. The Director of Central Intelligence, R. James Woolsey, was briefed within hours and immediately ordered a comprehensive damage assessment to determine what information Ames had compromised. Rick Ames was taken to an FBI facility in Northern Virginia for interrogation. The interrogation, which began on the day of his arrest and continued for several days, was conducted by FBI special agents and CIA counterintelligence officers, including Sandra Grimes. Ames, faced with overwhelming evidence, decided to cooperate in exchange for a plea agreement that would reduce the charges against his wife. What Ames revealed during his interrogation confirmed the investigators' worst fears. He confessed that he had begun spying for the KGB in April 1985 and had continued until his arrest. He admitted that he had provided the KGB with the identities of more than 20 CIA assets inside the Soviet Union. He acknowledged that his actions had led directly to the arrests and executions of at least 10 Soviet citizens who had been working for the United States. Ames explained his motivation primarily in terms of money. He said he had been facing financial difficulties related to his divorce and had initially approached the Soviets intending only to make a single contact for $50,000. But once he began receiving regular payments from the KGB, he found it impossible to stop. The money allowed him to live a lifestyle he had never been able to afford before. When asked whether he felt remorse for the people who had been executed because of his betrayal, Ames's responses were revealing. He said he had been able to rationalize his actions by convincing himself that the Soviets he had exposed were traitors to their own country and therefore deserved whatever punishment the Soviet system imposed on them. He said he never really thought of them as individuals with families and lives, but rather as abstract players in an intelligence game. This ability to dehumanize his victims had allowed him to continue for 9 years without being overwhelmed by guilt. Ames also provided details about his KGB handlers and his methods of communication. He described dead drop locations in the Washington area where he would leave packages of classified documents and where he would pick up money and instructions from the KGB. He explained the signaling system he used, chalk marks on mailboxes at specific locations that would indicate to his handlers that he had material to pass or needed a meeting. He provided information about trips abroad where he had met with KGB officers, including meetings in Bogotá, Caracas, and Rome. One detail that emerged from the interrogation was that Ames had no idea who had written the letter that had triggered the investigation. The investigation into the letter's origin was conducted separately. CIA and FBI. Investigators tried to determine who might have known enough about Ames's activities to write such a specific letter. One hypothesis was that the letter had been written by a CIA colleague who had noticed Ames's unexplained wealth and had become suspicious but didn't want to make a formal accusation without evidence. Making an unfounded accusation against a fellow officer could damage one's career, but sending an anonymous tip carried no such risk. Another hypothesis was that the letter had been written by someone in Ames's personal life, perhaps a neighbor or acquaintance who had observed his expensive purchases. A third hypothesis was that the letter had actually been sent by Soviet or Russian intelligence as part of an operation to cut ties with Ames in a controlled way. By 1991, the Soviet Union was collapsing, and the KGB was facing enormous internal turmoil. Some KGB officers might have decided that Ames had become too much of a liability. The truth about who wrote the letter was never established with certainty. The typewriter was analyzed and determined to be a common manual model that could not be traced to a specific owner. The paper was standard office stock. The postmark indicated the letter had been mailed from Arlington, but this provided no useful information. The investigation eventually reached a dead end. Rick Ames's trial was brief. On April 28, 1994, he appeared in federal court in Alexandria, Virginia, and entered a plea of guilty to charges of conspiracy to commit espionage. In exchange for his guilty plea and his cooperation with the continuing damage assessment, prosecutors agreed to recommend a sentence that would allow his wife Rosario to receive a reduced sentence. The plea agreement stipulated that Ames would receive life in prison without possibility of parole, while Rosario would receive a sentence of 5 years for conspiracy to commit espionage and tax evasion. At his sentencing hearing, Ames stood before Judge Claude Hilton and listened as the government presented its case. The prosecution detailed the extensive damage Ames had caused to American intelligence operations, the deaths of at least 10 Soviet citizens who had worked for the United States, and the compromise of countless classified documents and operational methods. Ames was given an opportunity to address the court. He spoke for approximately 15 minutes. He said, "I have betrayed my country, and I have betrayed the trust of my colleagues. I am deeply sorry for what I have done. The people who died because of my actions were brave men who were trying to make a better world, and they deserved better than what I gave them. I cannot undo what I have done, and I will live with that guilt for the rest of my life." Judge Hilton was blunt in his assessment. He said, "You have damaged the national security of the United States in ways that will take years to fully understand. You have caused the deaths of brave men who were working to advance the cause of freedom. And you have betrayed every principle that you swore to uphold when you joined the Central Intelligence Agency. You did all of this for money, not for ideology, not for principle, but simply because you wanted to live beyond your means and drive a nice car and live in a nice house. There is no excuse for what you have done, and the sentence of this court is that you will spend the rest of your natural life in federal prison." Rick Ames was immediately taken into custody and transported to the Federal Correctional Institution in Allenwood, Pennsylvania, a high-security federal prison where he would serve his life sentence. Rosario Ames was sentenced separately in October 1994 to 63 months in federal prison and was released in 1999 after serving her full sentence. She was subsequently deported to Colombia, where she reportedly lived quietly. The damage assessment that followed Ames's arrest and confession took more than 2 years to complete. CIA analysts worked with FBI counterintelligence specialists to review every document Ames had accessed, every operation he had been involved with, and every piece of classified information he could have compromised. The final damage assessment concluded that Ames had caused damage that was unprecedented in the CIA's history. Beyond the 10 executions, Ames had compromised more than 100 intelligence operations, including technical operations, covert action programs, and liaison relationships with foreign intelligence services. He had provided the KGB with classified documents detailing CIA operational methods, communication systems, and internal procedures. The compromise of this information had forced the CIA to redesign many of its operational methods and to abandon or restructure numerous ongoing operations. The financial cost of repairing the damage was estimated at more than $300 million, including the cost of the investigation itself, the cost of restructuring compromised operations, and the cost of improved security measures implemented to prevent similar penetrations in the future. For Sandra Grimes and Jeanne Vertefeuille, the successful conclusion of the investigation brought both satisfaction and frustration. They had spent 5 years working to identify the mole who had destroyed the CIA's Soviet operations, and they had ultimately succeeded in bringing Rick Ames to justice. But they were frustrated by how long the investigation had taken and by the fact that Ames had been able to operate undetected for 9 years despite numerous warning signs. In the years following Ames's arrest, both women participated in reviews of the case that examined what the CIA could have done differently. These reviews identified multiple points where Ames's suspicious behavior should have triggered more intensive scrutiny. His unexplained wealth had been noticed by several colleagues, but had never been formally reported or investigated. His heavy drinking had been documented in his personnel file, but had not been seen as a serious security concern. His access to classified information had never been reviewed to determine whether he actually needed access to all of the material he was able to see. The Ames case led to significant reforms in CIA security procedures. The agency implemented more rigorous financial disclosure requirements for employees with access to classified information. Random polygraph examinations were increased in frequency. Access to classified information was restructured so that employees only had access to the specific material they needed for their work, rather than broad access to entire categories of classified files. And the Office of Security was given more resources and authority to investigate suspicious behavior or financial irregularities. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. The Ames case shattered the assumption within the CIA that serious penetrations were primarily an external threat, that moles were people recruited by hostile intelligence services from outside, rather than trusted insiders who volunteered. After Ames, the CIA had to confront the reality that the greatest counterintelligence threats might come from within, from officers who had been thoroughly vetted and trusted for years. Sandra Grimes retired from the CIA in 1996, 2 years after Ames's arrest. She was 52 years old and had spent 29 years with the agency. She later co-authored a book about the investigation titled Circle of Treason, which provided a detailed account of the 5-year hunt for the mole. In interviews, Grimes was asked repeatedly about the letter and whether she had ever learned who wrote it. She always answered that the author's identity remained unknown, but she expressed gratitude to whoever it was for providing the tip that had ultimately led to Ames's capture. Jeanne Vertefeuille retired from the CIA in 1992 before Ames was arrested, though she continued to consult on the investigation. She was 60 years old and had spent 34 years with the agency. She lived quietly in retirement, declining most requests for interviews. She died in 2012 at the age of 80. Rick Ames remains in federal prison as of 2026. He is now 84 years old and has served 32 years of his life sentence. He has given occasional interviews from prison in which he has expressed varying degrees of remorse. In some interviews, he has acknowledged the harm he caused and has stated that he deserves to spend the rest of his life in prison. In other interviews, he has attempted to minimize his responsibility by blaming the CIA's bureaucratic culture, claiming that his espionage was motivated partly by disillusionment with what he saw as the agency's ineffectiveness. The families of those executed suffered devastating consequences. In the Soviet system of the 1980s, family members of executed traitors were often stigmatized and faced discrimination in employment and education. Children of executed intelligence traitors sometimes changed their names to escape the association. The CIA made efforts in later years to provide financial assistance to some of these families, though the amounts were modest. Dmitry Polyakov had been arrested in 1986, tried for treason in 1987, and executed by firing squad in March 1988. His wife, Lyudmila Polyakova, was not told the specific date of his execution. For months, she received no information about her husband's status or whereabouts. She sent letters to various Soviet government offices requesting information, but received only vague responses. It was not until nearly a year after his execution that she received official notification that he had been convicted of treason and sentenced to death, and that the sentence had been carried out. Her son, Alexander Polyakov, was 23 years old when his father was arrested. He was a student at a military institute in Leningrad, studying to become an officer in the Soviet Army. Upon his father's arrest, Alexander was immediately expelled from the institute. No explanation was provided beyond a terse statement that his continued enrollment was no longer appropriate given family circumstances. He was subsequently drafted into the regular army and assigned to a construction battalion in Siberia, essentially a punishment unit where soldiers performed hard labor under harsh conditions. Alexander spent 2 years in the construction battalion before being discharged. He returned to Leningrad and attempted to find work, but his father's conviction made employment difficult. Employers who learned of his family background refused to hire him. He eventually found work as a laborer in a factory, a position far below what his education and abilities would have qualified him for under normal circumstances. Lyudmila Polyakova lost her apartment in Moscow and was forced to move to a smaller city where she had relatives. She lived on a small pension and worked various jobs to supplement her income. She never remarried and spent the remainder of her life trying to clear her husband's name. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, some political prisoners and those convicted of anti-Soviet activities were posthumously rehabilitated. Lyudmila petitioned for her husband's rehabilitation, but her petition was denied. The Russian government maintained that Dmitry Polyakov had committed genuine espionage against the Soviet state, and that his conviction was therefore justified. Lyudmila died in 2003 at the age of 76, having never succeeded in rehabilitating her husband's name. Alexander Polyakov continued to live in Russia, working as an engineer. In interviews conducted after his mother's death, He spoke about growing up knowing that his father had been executed as a traitor, but not understanding why. He said he spent years believing his father had betrayed his country for selfish reasons, and it was only after learning the full story that his father had been providing intelligence to the United States for ideological reasons. Believing that Soviet military aggression needed to be constrained, that he began to understand his father's motivations. Alexander said in one interview, "My father believed he was preventing war. He believed that by giving the Americans information about Soviet military capabilities, he was helping to maintain the balance that prevented nuclear conflict. Whether he was right or wrong, I cannot say. But I know he was not a traitor in his own mind. He was trying to save the world from destruction. And he was betrayed by an American who sold him out for money to buy a car." The families of the other executed assets experienced similar devastation. Sergei Motorin's wife was forced to divorce him after his arrest to protect their two young daughters from stigmatization. She changed her surname and moved to a different city, telling her daughters that their father had died in an accident. The daughters did not learn the truth about their father's execution until they were adults in the 1990s. After the Soviet Union had collapsed. Valery Martinov's son was 7 years old when his father was arrested. He was told that his father had gone away on a long trip for work. He did not learn that his father had been executed until he was 18 years old, when his mother finally told him the truth. He said in a later interview that learning his father had been an intelligence traitor was devastating. But learning that he had been betrayed by an American mole who sold his identity for money was even worse. Adolf Tolkachev's wife and son faced particularly severe consequences. Tolkachev had been one of the CIA's most valuable technical intelligence sources. His arrest and execution in 1986 was followed by the arrest of his wife on charges of complicity in his espionage. She was sentenced to several years in a labor camp, though she was eventually released. Their son, who was in his early 20s, was expelled from university and struggled to find work. The letter that triggered the investigation was preserved as evidence and later became part of the historical record of American counterintelligence. It remains in FBI files. A single sheet of paper containing 4 sentences that helped bring down one of the most damaging spies in American history. The question of who wrote that letter has been the subject of speculation for more than 30 years. The most compelling theory is that it was written by someone within the CIA who had become suspicious but who lacked the evidence or the authority to make a formal accusation. This person would have known enough about Ames's financial situation to mention the specific details, but would have chosen to remain anonymous to avoid professional consequences. Whoever wrote it demonstrated both courage and caution. They provided specific information that could be investigated, but they didn't make accusations that couldn't be proven. They gave the investigators a starting point without exposing themselves to potential retaliation. And in doing so, they set in motion a chain of events that eventually brought to justice one of the most damaging traitors in American intelligence history. The story raises profound questions about institutional culture and the difficulty of detecting insider threats. Rick Ames had been able to spy for the KGB for 9 years, despite numerous warning signs. His sudden wealth was visible to anyone who knew him. His purchase of an expensive house and luxury car should have raised questions. His drinking should have been seen as a security concern, and his extensive access gave him the means to cause catastrophic damage. Yet no one at the CIA formally questioned these warning signs until the letter arrived. Part of the explanation is cultural. The CIA in the 1980s had a culture that valued loyalty and discouraged suspicion of fellow officers. The memory of James Angleton's destructive mole hunts had created a climate where counterintelligence suspicions were viewed with skepticism. But part of the explanation is also structural. The CIA's security procedures in the 1980s were not designed to detect the kind of threat that Ames represented. Financial disclosure forms were filed but not rigorously reviewed. Polygraph examinations were periodic but not frequent enough to detect ongoing espionage. Access to classified information was granted broadly rather than on a need-to-know basis. The reforms implemented after the Ames case addressed many of these structural weaknesses, but they could not eliminate the fundamental challenge of detecting insider threats. Intelligence agencies must grant their employees access to classified information and must trust them with sensitive operations. But this trust creates vulnerability because a trusted insider who decides to betray that trust has extraordinary opportunities to cause damage before being detected. The Ames case also highlights the moral complexity of espionage work. Rick Ames betrayed his country for money and caused the deaths of at least 10 men. His actions were indefensible. But the Soviet citizens he betrayed were themselves traitors to their own country, people who had chosen to spy for a foreign power against the interests of the Soviet state. From the Soviet perspective, they were criminals, and their executions were justice. This moral complexity is one of the defining features of intelligence work during the Cold War. Both sides recruited agents who betrayed their own countries. Both sides justified these betrayals as necessary for national security. Both sides executed traitors when they were caught, and both sides claimed moral superiority based on the ideological righteousness of their cause. The reality was that espionage created a world where loyalty and betrayal, heroism and treason, justice and murder were all matters of perspective, determined by which side of the ideological divide one occupied. Sandra Grimes, in her later reflections on the case, acknowledged this complexity. She said in one interview, "We tend to think of espionage cases in simple terms, good guys and bad guys, heroes and villains, but the reality is almost always more complicated. The men who died because of Ames were brave people who took extraordinary risks to provide information to the United States. But they were also people who betrayed their own country, and from the Soviet perspective, they deserved to be punished." Ames was absolutely wrong to betray them, but that doesn't make them entirely innocent either. They knew the risks they were taking, and they chose to take them anyway. The Ames case remains relevant more than 30 years later because it illustrates fundamental truths about intelligence work and insider threats. Trusted insiders with access to classified information will always pose the greatest counterintelligence threat. Financial pressures and personal problems will always create vulnerabilities that hostile intelligence services can exploit. And detecting these threats will always require systematic security procedures, institutional vigilance, and individual courage to report suspicions. The letter that arrived at CIA headquarters on February 21, 1991, represented that courage. Someone saw something suspicious and reported it. That decision to act, despite the risks, ultimately led to justice for the 10 Soviet citizens who had been executed and to accountability for the C-1A officer who had betrayed them. Rick Ames was 43 years old when he walked into the Soviet embassy in April 1985 and volunteered to become a spy. He was 52 years old when he was arrested in February 1994. In between those two dates, he destroyed the CIA's Soviet operations, caused the deaths of at least 10 men, compromised more than 100 intelligence operations, and lived a lifestyle of comfort paid for with blood money. He will die in federal prison, having spent more than half his life incarcerated. The 10 men who died are remembered differently by different people. In the United States, they are honored as assets who provided valuable intelligence during the final decade of the Cold War. In Russia, they are still officially regarded as traitors. Their families live with the complicated legacy of loving people who were both brave and traitorous, depending on one's perspective. And somewhere, the person who wrote the letter knows that they played a crucial role in bringing a traitor to justice. Whether they have ever revealed their identity, whether they feel pride or guilt, whether they are even still alive, these questions remain unanswered. The letter itself sits in FBI files, 4 sentences on a single sheet of paper that changed the course of American counterintelligence history.